There's a lab in Spirit Lake, Iowa, where one of the largest tackle companies on Earth spent decades and a real budget, paying a scientist with a PhD to answer one question: what actually makes a bass decide to bite? His name is Dr. Keith Jones. He ran the Berkeley Fish Research Center for the better part of 2 decades, and he put what he learned into a book called Knowing Bass. Here's the part the bait aisle would rather you never sit with. One of his more striking conclusions is that how lifelike your lure looks matters far less than anglers. And lure marketing. Assume. Read that again. The company selling you photorealistic paint jobs employed a scientist who found that the fish, for the most part, doesn't much care what your bait looks like. So if it isn't the look, what is it? It's chemistry. Dissolved molecules, read by a sense most anglers don't even know they're fighting against. Today we rank the 10 attractants every angler has tried, not by marketing, not by one weekend on one lake, but by what the published science actually says. Some are useless, some are quietly toxic. And the one that beats all 10 is something you can make for free from the fish already swimming under your boat. And the reason it wins is going to surprise you. DHE-UNLL that ranks TMLL. Before the countdown, you need the single rule that decides every spot on this list. Because once you have it, you can rank half these products yourself. Picture 2 drops hitting a glass of water, 1 drop of food coloring, 1 drop of cooking oil. The dye blooms outward and fills the glass. The oil sits in a slick and goes nowhere. To a fish, a smell behaves exactly the same way. A scent only exists underwater if it dissolves. Chemists call the dye water-loving and the oil water-fearing, and that one property is the great divider. A water-loving compound spreads into a trail a predator can follow back to the source. A water-fearing one clings to your bait and broadcasts nothing. So here's the law: no bottle prints on its label. If it will not dissolve, the fish cannot smell it, no matter how strong it smells to you. Keep that in your back pocket. It's about to sink the bottom 4 entries on this list before we even discuss them. WHE Fish Ice ACT Tuoli Reading. Reading. And what is it the fish reads in that dissolving trail? Not shad or worm the way you'd smell coffee. Individual dissolved molecules, mostly free amino acids, the broken down building blocks of protein, and the chemical fingerprint of living or dying flesh. How fine is that sense? Dr. John Caprio, who spent a career at Louisiana State University wiring up the nerves of catfish to measure exactly what they detect, recorded responses to certain amino acids down around 1/1000th of a mole per liter. Nanomolar. A trace so faint it's almost impossible to picture. That isn't a marketing slogan. It's a number measured in a living nerve. So when the industry waves the vague word scent at you, understand what it's hiding. The fish isn't smelling a vibe. It's running a molecule count. And the molecules that score highest on that count have names, which is exactly how we're going to rank the bottles. Let's start at the bottom. Number 10, WD-40. THE-MYTH that want DIE. We start with the most famous fish attractant that isn't one. Go to any forum and you'll find men swearing a shot of WD-40 fills their cooler, some insisting it's secretly made with fish oil. So go to the source. The WD-40 company states plainly, in writing, that there is no fish oil in it, and that they do not recommend using it to attract fish. The can is petroleum solvent and light lubricating oil, completely water-fearing, which, by our one law, means the fish literally cannot smell it. So why does anyone catch fish after spraying it on? Because the petroleum film smothers something on your hands, and we'll get to exactly what that is much higher up this list. For now, understand that WD-40 isn't attracting a thing. It's a cover-up. It's mildly toxic to the water you're standing in, and you'd get the same masking effect from a handful of lake mud. It lands at number 10, not because it does nothing, but because it convinces millions of anglers it's doing the exact opposite of what it actually does. Number 9. Coking, Espiré, and Kchen oils. Number 9 is the same mistake from a different aisle. Canola spray, vegetable oil. the can of non-stick someone swears by. All of it is oil, all of it water-fearing, all of it broadcasting nothing into the water. Yes, a film of oil will briefly mask the scent on your fingers. So will motor oil, and nobody's calling that an attractant. Worse, if you spray oil onto a soft plastic bait, you can seal its surface and trap whatever water-soluble scent the lure was built to leak. You don't upgrade the bait. You gag it. Number 9 exists for one reason. To remind you that it smells strong to me is not the same thing as the fish can smell it, which is precisely the trap waiting in our next entry. Number 8. Anise and licorice oil. Number 8 is the one the old-timers swear by, anise, that black licorice oil that's been smeared on lures for a century. It smells almost violently strong to a human, so surely it works on fish. And that instinct is exactly backwards. Anise's punch comes from a compound called anethole, and anethole is, you guessed it, an oil. It barely dissolves. It clings to the lure and refuses to spread a trail through the water column. As a mask for the oils on your skin, it's passable. As something that actively draws a fish in from distance, the chemistry puts it near the bottom. The lesson of entries 10, 9, and 8 is one the industry will never print on a label. How strong a smell hits you in open air tells you almost nothing about whether it survives underwater. Now let's get to the products where the chemistry finally shows up. Number 7. Bologna and processed meat. At number 7, chemistry finally enters the picture, sort of. This is the catfish trick, a slice of bologna or a cut hot dog on a hook. And here it helps to know what a catfish actually is. Dr. Caprio's lab famously called catfish swimming tongues, and they meant it nearly literally. A catfish carries its taste buds on the outside of its body, hundreds of thousands of them, across its whiskers, fins, and skin, so it's tasting the water everywhere it swims. Bologna does release some amino acids as its proteins break down, and a catfish, built to find food by chemistry in muddy, dark water, will track that. But here's the catch the kitchen trick crowd skips over. Processed meat is loaded with salt, sugar, and chemical preservatives, a profile that looks nothing like natural prey and one that genuinely puts off pickier game fish like bass and walleye. So bologna earns number 7 on a technicality. It works, but only on the least discerning fish in the lake and almost never on the ones most anglers are actually chasing. The next entry is where the marketing budgets really live. Number SX. Com Urkeal Garlic SPRE. Number 6 is the most marketed smell in the history of fishing, garlic in a bottle. And I want to be fair here, because unlike the oils, the core idea isn't wrong. Garlic's bite comes from a sulfur compound called allicin, and sulfur compounds are exactly the kind of thing a fish's chemistry notices. There's even real evidence. A peer-reviewed feeding study on largemouth bass found that allicin, along with a compound called betaine, measurably increased how much the fish struck and fed. So garlic can move a fish. But here's where I have to call something out, because you'll see it repeated in other science videos as gospel. A claim that a University of Wisconsin study showed garlic boosting strike rates by exactly 91%. I went looking for that study. It doesn't appear to exist. That oddly specific number gets passed around because it sounds authoritative, and that is precisely the kind of fake precision this channel exists to strip out. The honest science is simpler and less flashy. Garlic's active molecule works, but allicin is chemically unstable. It begins breaking down almost immediately, faster in heat and light. A compound that degrades in minutes does not sit in a hot plastic bottle for 2 years and come out at full strength. Number 6 is a real idea sold to you in a dead form, which is exactly why number 5 beats it for pennies. Number 5, fresh garlic. Number 5 is the same molecule, alive. Crush a raw clove of garlic in your fingers, and you've just generated fresh allicin seconds before it touches the water. The exact compound the bottle is trying and failing to keep stable on a shelf. It's the difference between coffee ground this morning and coffee that's been sitting open since last spring. Press it onto a soft plastic and you're delivering the real, undegraded sulfur signal at full strength. It's not a miracle. Garlic was never the top of this list, but as a cheap, legitimate edge that actually respects the chemistry, fresh beets bottled every single time. The bait industry can't sell you this because it can't bottle fresh. And from here up, every entry is something the fish is genuinely built to hunt. Number 4, menhaden and forage fish oil. At number 4, we hit the entry that seems to break our one law, and understanding why it doesn't is the whole point. Menhaden oil, pressed from the oily baitfish nearly every predator eats, gets coated on lures by tournament anglers who swear by it. But wait, oil is water-fearing, so shouldn't the fish be blind to it? Here's the trick. Raw menhaden oil isn't a pure, refined lipid. It's a messy suspension carrying water-soluble proteins and breakdown compounds trapped inside it. Think of the oil less as the smell itself and more as a slow-dissolving capsule. It clings to your lure, and as water washes over it, it leaks those water-soluble compounds out gradually instead of all at once. That's the real reason it outperforms a watery spray that rinses off on the first cast. Not because the oil is smelled, but because it's a delivery system. And this is the correction to a claim you'll hear elsewhere, that the oil itself wafts out and gets detected from some exact number of feet away. The honest mechanism is humbler and more useful. It's a carrier that keeps a real signal working longer. Number 4 is the first entry that truly earns its money, and the next one is the bait industry's single most honest product. Number 3. Amino acid and nucleotide scent gels. Number 3 is where the chemistry and the price tag finally shake hands. The premium scent gels, the pro-cures and the serious amino acid formulas. And to explain why these are legitimate, I have to take you back to that lab in Iowa and to a bigger body of science most anglers never hear about. There's an entire field whose only job is to figure out what makes fish eat, not fishing, but aquaculture, the science of fish farming. To make a farmed fish attack a dry pellet that smells like almost nothing, scientists had to identify the exact molecules that trigger feeding, and they published the answers in the open. In a landmark review, the researchers Kasoumian and Doving cataloged them across dozens of species, the amino acids glycine, alanine, and proline, plus a compound called betaine that works like a volume knob, amplifying the others, and a second family. The nucleotides, inosine and inosine monophosphate, the molecules released as flesh breaks down, the chemical dinner bell that only rings when something edible is dying nearby. The good scent gels carry exactly these, suspended in a sticky base that clings and leaks like the menhaden oil. The chemistry inside is real, and Dr. Jones's own work at Berkeley was built on pinning down which of these flavors fish chase and which they spit out. Here's the expose, though. None of it is secret. It's been sitting in fisheries journals for 40+ years. You're not paying for hidden knowledge. You're paying for the bottle and the camo label wrapped around public domain science. Number 3, works. You're just overpaying for it. And there's a reason the best formulas blend several of these molecules instead of betting on one. Kasoumian and Doving's review is blunt that taste preference is species-specific, that no single compound is a universal key, and that what lights up a catfish can leave a trout cold. The gels that actually earn their shelf space hedge with a spread of stimulants. The cheap ones bet everything on one hyped ingredient and a loud label. And the next entry costs nothing at all, because it isn't something you add. Number TWO, erasing, he, scent, broadcasting. Number 2 is the attractant the industry can't sell you because there's no bottle for it, removing the repellent already on your hands. In 1956, researchers Dr. Idler, Fagerlund, and Mayo published a study in the Journal of General Physiology with a title that should hang in every tackle shop, a salmon repellent in mammalian skin. What they found is that the rinse off a human hand contains an amino acid called L-serine, and migrating salmon detect it and actively flee from it at staggering dilution, on the order of 1 part in several million parts of water. Later work showed a human hand rinse repels every Pacific salmon species tested. Sit with that. While you're spraying attractant onto your lure to add a good smell, your bare fingers may be coating it in a chemical fish are hardwired to read as danger. This is the inconvenient truth WD-40 and cooking oil were accidentally stumbling onto at the bottom of this list. They don't attract, they just smother that human signal badly. So do it on purpose instead. Rinse your hands in lake water, handle a little of the local mud or forage, and keep the perfume, gasoline, and sunscreen off your bait. It earns the number 2 slot because for a pressured, wary fish, not smelling like a predator beats almost anything you could add. Almost. Because there's one thing that beats it, and it's the surprise of this entire list. So here's the winner, and it's going to sound wrong at first. The single most powerful attractant you can put on a lure is not fresh ground baitfish. It's that same local forage, deliberately broken down, fermented or hydrolyzed, until it half dissolves itself. Every other science video crowns a fresh grind as the gold standard. The chemistry says they're stopping 1 step short, and here's why. Remember the one rule. The fish reads dissolved molecules, mostly free amino acids. But in fresh, intact tissue, most of those amino acids are still chained together inside long proteins. Picture a necklace with the beads strung tight, where the fish can only read the loose beads, not the strung ones. A fresh grind frees some, but the proteins are still mostly whole. Now let the fish's own enzymes and salt-tolerant microbes work on it for a while. The exact process behind every fermented fish sauce on Earth, the nuoc mam and the bagong and the Roman garum. And those protein necklaces get snipped apart, bead by bead, into a flood of free amino acids and tiny peptides. Aquaculture scientists have a name for this: fish protein hydrolysate. A 2021 review in the journal Reviews in Aquaculture lays it out plainly. Those small peptides and free amino acids act as powerful feeding attractants, precisely because they are the dissolved signal the receptors are built to read. So the gold standard is local forage, the species your fish were imprinted on since birth, but processed the way 2,000 years of kitchens already figured out, pre-digested, so the signal is unlocked instead of trapped. Grind your lake's shad or shiners, work in a little salt, give it time, and you've made a free, hyper-concentrated amino acid bomb that no $20 bottle can match. Because the bottle is just a worse, more expensive imitation of exactly this. The winner was never on the shelf. It was the oldest trick on Earth, aimed at the fish already swimming under your boat. Now, an honest note this channel owes you. A fresh grind does hold one thing a long ferment slowly loses: the burst of fresh nucleotides, that dying flesh dinner bell, which fades the longer breakdown runs. So the real play is a short, controlled breakdown, not letting it rot for a season, long enough to unlock the amino acids, not so long that you lose the freshness signal entirely. Theach E rules that decide WH were NEOFIT works. Knowing the ranking is useless if you break the physics, so let's close the loop with the part that separates full coolers from empty ones. First, a scent trail is not permanent. The moment your bait hits the water, the dissolved molecules start drifting off and thinning out, faster in current and wind. The most common amateur mistake is dressing the lure once at the ramp and fishing it for hours, certain it's still working when it's long since gone quiet. The fix isn't a better bottle. It's the discipline to refresh after a stretch of casting and after every fish, or accept that you're throwing a clean, odorless lure. Second, temperature runs the clock. Molecules move faster when they're warm, the way dye races across hot water and crawls across cold. So in cold water, your trail barely spreads, and you want a concentrated source pressed right where the fish are holding. And third, the rule no one selling you product will say out loud: More is not better, and mixing everything together is worse. A natural prey signal is a specific recipe at a specific strength. Drown your bait or stack 3 scents on top of each other and you don't build a super lure. You build a chemical smear that matches nothing alive. And a fish that's felt a hook before will simply slide away from it. Match the local forage, keep it fresh, keep it clean, and let the water carry it. VHE SC Iance Was never FOR sail. So strip it all down. The fish ignoring your lure isn't lucky, and it isn't smarter than you. It's a chemistry machine, reading vanishing traces of dissolved molecules and deciding in a heartbeat whether your bait says food or danger. The tackle industry's whole business is convincing you that ants are lives in a shiny bottle with a tough name. But the company's own scientist wrote a book saying the look barely matters. The aquaculture researchers published the real triggers decades ago, and a study from 1956 told us the worst thing on your lure might be your own hands. None of it was forbidden. It was just never sold to you straight. So crush real garlic instead of buying dead Allison. Rinse the predator smell off your hands before you ever touch the bait. And when you want the thing that actually wins, take the forage already swimming under your boat, let it break down the way humans have for 2,000 years, and hand the fish the one signal no laboratory can sell. The bait industry needs you to believe the secret is expensive. The science has been telling you, the whole time, that it was never for sale. If this changed how you'll look at your tackle box on the next trip, subscribe and tell me in the comments which buried corner of the fishing business to pull into the light next. Until then, keep your lines tight and your chemistry honest. This is Forbidden Lures.